Hey, we just heard Bored from the Deftones album Adrenaline. This is 1995 Crucial Years in Metal, Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And this appears to be part 6. Well, number 6 so there's 5 more after this, if that makes sense. And our countdown of, in our humble opinion, the crucial years of metal. 1995 is sort of the year metal died in a weird way.
Metal died, and there's also, this is like the most unbelievable records, it seems like. Well, the list that started coming together is just kind of retarded.
I think each year it gets tougher and tougher, cut out babies that we love dearly and think of as children in a way. And 95 is a weird year because this is sort of when
big transition year. New metal was coming to prominence.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of new metal, we'll come back to why we played the Deftones and all that stuff, and why, in our humble opinion, it's a relevant record in its own right. But yeah, new metal. This is sort of where death metal has kind of all but disappeared or became kind of a parody of itself. I mean, you had some good death metal records that were still coming out. Death Symbolic, but that's not really even a death metal record. It's more of like just a great heavy metal record at this point. 6 Feet Under, Haunted was in Morbid Angel Domination, Suffocation, Pierced from Within. But these are sort of rare examples. I mean, a lot of the original,
the established bands, and we've got like Wrong Records coming into prominence with the War Comp and like that whole other like Gothenburg-ish kind of super melodic metal at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, not the Stockholm scene had sort of cycled itself out. The Florida scene had kind of cycled itself out, and was looking for some new blood. And in America, what kind of filled that hole was a whole lot of different kind of flavors, I guess you could say, and some of the flavors were really pretty awful. With the whole new metal scene and stuff.
But then the kind of a return to rock and roll,
sure,
as well.
A lot of
because bands like
throwback stuff.
Yeah, like Hiatus, that were kind of, this was their last record they put out this year. But then you've got Monster Magnet doing Dopes to Infinity.
Yeah, and Clutch
Down.
Clutch, Down. So the whole kind of stoner rock and roll type scene was kind of starting up.
Fu Manchu was coming out at this point.
And groove metal had kind of taken its hold over America in a way with kind of the
what's groove metal?
Kind of what Pantera and White Zombie were sort of doing. This sort of just like groovy, but still heavy, but yet like catchy enough for people to kind of buy into it. And it was a weird time. Thrash had been dead for a few years now, and a lot of those bands didn't really know what to do. We're still a year away from the return of Metallica with Load and Unload and Reload and
the Symphony record and Garage Inc. And they put out a
Re-Garage Inc. Was it?
I don't remember
what the hell.
No, it was Garage Inc. Revisited.
Yeah, there you go.
Which actually, I mean, it's got a great Merciful Fate medley. Beyond that,
I mean, there's anyways. I don't want to talk about Metallica because this is not 1996. This is 95. But what started to happen is, everyone, it was an opportunity for everyone to sort of experiment with. And Mark and I have often talked on a lot of our episodes about sort of the weird thing that kind of started to happen in 96, 97, especially to bands that were at like the core for us, like the Paradise Lost, the Anathemas, the My Dying Brides, and some of those bands started to go through their own cycle of experimentation because it seemed like when things kind of implode in 1995, this being sort of the last like really great peak year where there was a lot of like metal community still organized, it offers metal a chance to sort of almost die and reinvent itself, and that's probably been good for like the last 10, 15 years. Really.
Well, it seems like it happens probably every 6 years, especially with the established bands like with like your Brides and things like that, and Dark Tranquilities and even In Flames to some degree, even though it's not quite the kind of direction I'd like to see them going. But I mean, this was almost, I think 95 is probably the big transition year for a lot of these big bands too, right before they kind of they do their 34% completes.
Things like that. And their 1 seconds and things like that. And this is, just thinking back to where I was in 1995 compared to where Mark was. I mean, you guys at this point are so firmly entrenched in the underground scene. You're Requiem is sort of hitting on all cylinders at this point. You're about to start working for Relapse at
96,
so
all the mainstream stuff's almost completely off my radar.
And this is and that what makes this show odd, the 1995 one odd, is this is really where like my group of friends, I was like a sophomore in high school when this came out, or when 95 was sort of rolling through, and this is where like my worlds are about to merge. This is the year that I'm going to meet Chris, who's who did Requiem with Mark and who's been on the show, helping us out a couple times before. And, you know, I mean, this is a weird year for me because I'm going to the record store and I'm buying Deftones, but I'm also buying At the Gate, Slaughter of the Soul. And I'm sort of towing this weird line between, you know, where am I? Am I in the mainstream metal scene anymore? Or, you know, where am I going to go and stuff? So this year is really important to me from that perspective, you know. And going back to the record we opened up with, Deftones, I mean, Adrenaline, this was sort of, you know, they were a band that Korn supposedly discovered, and, you know, another Los Angeles kind of new metal band and stuff. It had some, I don't want to say rap aspects to it, but there's certainly some kind of different, almost hip hoppy influences that were going on without being totally like suffocating or
more for their rhythm section than anything else. Like the bass has a little bit more life to it, as with the drum beats are a little snappier. But I mean, Deftones is a band that has greatly surpassed supposedly their discoverers of Korn, which are kind of a one-hit wonder, really. When you look at, they've never really kind of hit that next level. Yeah,
well, I mean, in terms of popularity, Korn's always outpaced Deftones, but in terms of like developing and where their sound evolved, no one who heard the early Deftones, you know, this record would have thought that they would have ended up where they are in terms of being this sort of dynamic, shoegazy, Catatonia, like, you know, really, I think pretty emotional band.
They share a lot of similarities with Catatonia now for sure. And with after like White Pony is the first album I think heard in its entirety. I was like, oh my God, this is unbelievable.
Well, what was odd is I was so into Adrenaline, we actually went and saw Deftones when nobody really knew about them, to the point where we actually got to hang out with the guys as I'm staring at this cover that's signed by the guys. And we got up on stage and actually played during the warm-up with them. I remember one of my buddies, Paul Dyer, played 1 week on stage with them a little bit when they were just sound checking and stuff. So it was like nobody knew who the Deftones were, but we were really into them because of we had heard some of their songs on Concrete Corner tape sampler things, and which we'll come back to Concrete Corner later in the episode too when we talk about Paradise Lost. But yeah, it was weird because I got into this record, and then, as I said, there's a snap judgment that has to happen for my group of friends about 95, 96, and we immediately abandoned pretty much all of this stuff like within a year, you know. And by the time that the second Deftones record rolls around, which in hindsight's a great record, I just had dismissed them.
Was that Around the Fur?
Yeah, I had just dismissed them as being a new metal band. And I was like, I don't like Deftones anymore. You know, almost like the only band that we actually took from this era forward with us was probably Tool. You know, and we didn't really attach any stigma to Tool.
It took so many years between albums to come out that they didn't fit in any scene, really.
Yeah. So, you know, Mark and I will stand behind the Deftones being, you know, a valuable, you know, addition to the metal community. And
even their new record that just came out,
it's great.
Completely valid in the context of this era of, well, I mean, almost all the boundaries are kind of breaking down at this point too. So
so that's why we wanted to start off with that, because in a way that represents sort of the new, like it or hate it, that's sort of the new direction that metal as a mainstream genre is going to start to move towards, you know, and a band like Deftones and kind of defines at least the good side of that whole new metal thing, you know, that's going to turn into a shit fest. But in terms of, you know, some other American stuff, really America had splintered, like we said. And so the next set of music we were going to kind of, you know, get into was going to sort of play to some of these like diverging genres and stuff. You know, I mean, this was a year where Mr. Bungle, Disco Volante had come out along with King for a Day from Faith No More. So Mike Patton was making his, you know, kind of stamp on society. We already mentioned some of the death metal records that came out. White Zombie's Astrokeep 2000 was probably the big American metal record of this year.
Especially for radio play.
Yeah, for sure. You know, More Human Than Human. Like, shoot me if I hear that song again. You know, in terms for people, I know Mark and I aren't really big fans, but I know a lot of people do get kind of stoked about Devin Townsend. The first Strapping Young Lad came out, and there was a lot of hype around that, and had a couple cool songs on there, at least from my point of view.
And brought the skullet into vogue.
Yes, it did. And, you know, this is odd because Mark's talked about this. I remember when we did the Tiamat show, you and Chris talked about the In the Eyes of Death comp and what a big comp that was for you guys, being a Century Media introduction to a lot of cool bands. This was, for me, you know, there were a couple compilations that came out, including Century Media's First Identity comp, which had like a lot of cool stuff, including Strapping Young Lad and some things on there. And then the UHF VHF Nuclear Blast Relapse comp, where I heard Dissection and Dismember for the first time. So
yeah, because 96 would have been 96 or early 97 was when Relapse dissolved its relationship with Nuclear Blast.
Yeah. So, but Yeah, I know my group of friends, besides listening to Caius and the self-titled Clutch, we were also listening to COC Deliverance, which unfortunately was released in November 94, so we couldn't throw it into this.
And talk about, kind of like changing styles or diverging styles. I mean, going from like a hardcore punk band to almost a thrash band to southern rock / fuzzed out whatever
stuff. Yeah. And speaking of that stuff, we've got a couple of stonery, doomy kind of mismatches of genres kind of coming up, because again, this was sort of what America was going on, or America was up to. We're going to start with one that's not stonery doom, but really defined another type of musical genre that was starting to really take hold in the 90s, which was a sort of industrial metal hybrid kind of thing that was happening because of Ministry and Nine Inch Nails' success, and Godflesh and Pitch Shifter. And Fear Factory kind of takes the torch and becomes one of the big Roadrunner bands. They almost take the torch from some of the death metal bands like Obituary and things like that had been like the face of Roadrunner, and bands like Fear Factory and Machine Head, kind of move forward, and Sepultura, when they start to like new metal it up a little with Roots, and stuff, they'll kind of become the new face of like Roadrunner America metal stuff.
Becomes like kind of the crossover, more extreme stuff for the new metal kids.
Absolutely. I mean, this is still a very heavy record, Fear Factory's Demanufacture, and thematically and lyrically wise, I mean, it's, if you're into Blade Runner and Terminator, and I mean, it's a fairly intelligent record. I know that Mark, this was, you were so far away from Fear Factory at this point that
Soul of a New Machine was interesting when it came out to me, but this, I still cannot get into this record. I don't know if it's the stop start. I mean, this is, was this the year that Meshuggah?
Yes, this is, and we'll talk about Meshuggah later. But
that's the same kind of thing where it's just like, I don't understand the appeal. It just, it gets lost in translation with me.
And to be fair to Mark too, I mean, Mark, you've never been like the world's biggest like tech metal head either. That's been more something like, I guess Chris and I were more into than you. You like your metal, it's a little rough, sloppier, sludgier.
Rough around the edges, a little bit more organic.
Yeah, which is, Fear Factory is anything but organic, and that's sort of the point. They're very like futuristic, industrial, and that kind of thing. But so we've got Self-Biased Resistor on the way from Demanufacture, and then Monster Magnet's Dopes to Infinity and Down's NOLA, which New Orleans, Louisiana is what it stands for. Those were in couple other big kind of, I guess, American records. Monster Magnet Dopes to Infinity really was like the rolling the red carpet out on the whole like stoner scene in a sense. It was like the
which I still hate that using that term for it.
It is. I don't know what a lame genre.
It's
term.
It's
just
rock.
Doom. It's doom rock,
or whatever. But Down's also kind of like one of the first big crossovers between underground metal, like with I Hate God and Crowbar, and then, Phil Anselmo from Pantera, which is huge at this point.
I mean, him putting his stamp on that was like a really big deal. And I remember, too, seeing Pantera during this era as well. And Phil talked on stage for quite a while about Dark Throne and Emperor.
You'd always see him in a Transylvanian Hunger, T-shirt.
And
too.
I mean, as much of a knucklehead as a lot of people probably think he is, I mean, he has sort of lived and died for the metal scene. Whatever his downfall or misgivings are.
Yeah, at this point, he almost kind of like sacrifices all of his mainstream success for what he's really into, which is kind of admirable in a way.
In a way you got to respect that. And Down, this is a really huge record, especially this and Monster Magnet were big ones for Grindcore Coon and I. But it was cool to see like Black Sabbath mixed with sort of COC Southern rock, and then also like just amped and kind of sludgified a little bit with that kind of I Hate God kind of nastiness to it, so it was a dirty record by all means, but fantastic. So, but
this is, what label was this on? It was on Sire, or
it was on East West Records, Electra.
Interscope,
Electra.
Okay.
So I mean, these are bands that are now getting kind of on the mainstream and starting to make a bigger feel. Atlantic was putting out Clutch, and it was kind of an odd scene going on. And I think there was a sense that some of these bands like Monster Magnet, when the song We're Gonna Play, Negasonic Teenage Warhead, came out, there was a sense maybe this was gonna blow some of these bands up. And none of them did. You know, it was kind of weird. They like had their moment, then they kind of...
Yeah, I mean, a band like I Hate God, purely given their name, is not going to have mainstream success. And how, like, I mean, how harsh and kind of unforgiving and relentless it is. But
I meant more like the Monster Magnets and the Downs and the COC.
And even like Crowbar kind of like came to some prominence. I mean, they toured with Pantera off the Vulgar Display of Power tour. Yeah. And that's where I first heard them. I was like, the ugliest group of guys you'd ever see, but they were heavy as hell.
Oh man, slow and heavy and nasty and all that. So, yeah, but so these are I guess 3 positive areas that the American scene is kind of going into in this time period. And so we're going to hear Fear Factory, Self-Bias, Resistor, Negasonic, Teenage Warhead from Monster Magnet, and Hail the Leaf from Down. And then we'll end with a surprise twist that's going to take us in a whole new direction.
Eliminate final views to captivate. your face last night on the tube. Strong fine snake in a sucker's vacuum. 15 clicks and it's time to say bye. 15 trips and a love that won't die. Got a world to save. Broadcasting revolution don't pay. Strapped up freaks on the Lazarus plane. I can tell just by the crime, I can tell just by the style. I was born and raised on Venus, and I may be here a while. And a supersonic general who wants into your game. Like I'm in summertime and genius who jumped into the pain. I will deny you. I will deny you, baby. I will deny you. I will deny you, baby. I will deny you. I will deny you, baby. I will deny you. I will deny you, oh baby, I'm lazy. Oh baby, introduce me to God. Oh baby, I'm lazy. Oh baby, set a place for the door, on the door. Shut me off, 'cause I've gone crazy with this planet in my hands. Shut me off, 'cause I've gone crazy with this planet in my hands. Shut me off, 'cause I've gone crazy with this planet in my hands. Shut me off, 'cause I've gone crazy with this planet in my hands. I can tell this by the climate, and I can tell this by the style. I was born and raised on Venus, and I may be here a while. And a supersonic general who wants into the game. Like in the summertime and genius who just in that pain. I will deny you. I will deny you, baby. I will deny you. I will deny you, baby. I will deny you. I will deny you, baby. I will deny you. I will deny you, fail to rise, and I cower.
take your own. Sick with fever and cry out loud to God. Your sorry will be piled upon me that I can't see, my God. I've cried for us more than once, but rivers still run with reddest tears, me lost in me, and I'll never need to ask who wants me, who wants me.
That was from Darkest Skies, from My Dying Bride's Angel and the Dark River. Before that, we had Down, Monster Magnet, and then Fear Factory. So we've gone now, Mark, from America to a much gloomier, doomier place, which is sort of we're kind of touching Europe now.
Yeah.
And starting to look at the
couple things are gonna. Well, I guess Bride is from the UK, and then we were gonna have some Paradise Lost as well coming up from the same geographic region and kind of with the same roots, but really different kind of approaches and how they really kind of like progressed into what they become down the road. And with My Dying Bride, this is like the first album where Aaron Stainthorpe basically dropped the death vocals altogether.
Completely, yeah. And he's starting to do it a lot on Turn Loose the Swans, half and half, and then. But
this you actually see like, I mean, he's a non-conventional vocalist in his approach for sure. He's not like a great. He doesn't have a great range, but he has a really unique approach, and
it's very emotive. I mean,
totally. I mean, it's gothy in a sense, but it's not the paint your eyes black and slit your wrist kind of stuff either. It actually lyrically feels really, really genuine. Mm-hmm. This is one of the first records I really got into lyrically because everything just had an air of truth to it. Mm-hmm. And so this album was huge for nobody really that I knew that was into Bride, like even batted an eye when this came out. We're just like, it's great. I didn't miss the death metal vocals at all.
Yep. Yeah, and it had a total street cred, and it's a weird record too because this is one that I've found through the years that I can get a lot of my friends who are females that aren't really into metal can kind of get behind it.
I think it's got a lot of honesty to it. I think that's what really
genuine
comes across.
Kind of romantic.
Same with like a lot of the Anathema stuff at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, and speaking of the sort of British doom scene that was kind of going on at this point, this is sort of a big transitional year for a lot of these bands. Anathema Silent Enigma came out and Pentecost 3 earlier in the year, and Pentecost 3 was sort of the last Darren vocals, and Silent Enigma was where Vincent, who now is primarily the vocalist, kind of had to learn how to sing in the studio and kind of use this
cowboyed up, man,
tortured, vocal kind of approach. And Silent Enigma is if we had room for maybe like one more song on the show, definitely Silent Enigma.
But you can go back and check out the Anathema part 1 and 2 that we did.
We did a 2-parter on that and stuff. But in terms of this sort of doom and gloom kind of scene, Catatonia's For Funerals to Come EP came out, which was in a way a transitional record away from Dance of December Souls type sound towards what they were going to become.
Mm-hmm. There's less black metal influence for sure.
More kind of doomy and
they open themselves up like huge.
You also had things like Cathedral's Carnival Bazaar, which even though it was British, had just as much in common with Bride and Paradise Lost as it did like what you just heard, like Monster Magnet and Down and some of that stuff. I mean, it was entrenched in like stoner scene, Black Sabbath, just gloomy, doom.
And then you have,
rock,
Dismember, a staple of the Stockholm scene, like really opening up their sound, and to some people hated it, but David Bloomquist actually pulled out this almost like Iron Maiden lead tone. They started using that a lot of warmth to the record. And there was a little bit of backlash with Massive Killing Capacity when it came out, but
see, that was the first Dismember I heard.
It stands up, it still stands up really well. Then you've got established like anarcho-punk acts like ENT coming out with Retribution, kind of like a comeback record for them, with most of the band reestablished. And
Napalm Death's Greed Killing EP came out, which was kind of pretty controversial. I mean, the follow-up to that, Diatribes, I think a lot of people hate it, and that's really where Napalm went through, I guess, 3 records of sort of soul-searching.
Their growing pains.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of instances of new metal-ish kind of tinges to the record, too. Mm-hmm. It's like, where do you take the whole grindcore thing at this point? They had 8 records out at this point or something, and lineup changes still. Like Mick was gone at this point, so it was like Danny Hara had been on for a couple records maybe at this point too. But
I think he had started on Utopia Banished.
Yep.
So
and then we've got the whole call and response guttural and female vocal thing that started with, and actually the first Theater Tragedy record is actually quite good, but it kind of, that, I don't know if this record necessarily opened the floodgates, but this is where we started seeing it with all the Napalm Record stuff, and it's just
And another dynamic sort of doomy female sort of approach that came out was, this is the first appearance of Annika in The Gathering when they put out Mandalion in 95, and that's, I mean, I love The Gathering, almost everything they've done. They've got a couple, boring records that prior to this last one that came out, but for the most part, they've been a really consistent.
Oh, they got a new
band.
vocalist too.
Yeah, and that's kind of injected
breath
a little
of energy. Yeah,
so the Doom scene is kind of in a good place. It's weird, because when Cathedral put out Force of Equilibrium in '90, there was such an oddball record, and everyone was fast, and it's almost like because of what grunge was doing to the mainstream American music with like bands like Alice in Chains and Soundgarden, they really had their roots in Sabbath more than anything.
Yeah,
all of a sudden, like doom metal is kind of becoming like acceptable, both in America and to a certain extent. I mean, Tony Iommi played on Cathedral's Carnival Bazaar,
Utopia Blaster,
and so it was kind of an odd era in a sense, especially with what was kind of going on in Europe. And there were some bands that were trying to move more towards less away from like the death metal roots and more towards rock and roll stuff too.
Well, and these bands, these guys, like when they're starting out, they're like 15, 16, 17. They're in their 20s now. It's like, okay, you're finding out who you are as a person musically too. So it's like, okay, you're definitely going to like spread out all your influence and stuff's going to be seeping in big time.
Yeah.
I think with Cathedral, this record's it's a transitional record. I mean, it's not an essential record. It's solid from front to back, but it's not anything that it's not a must have by any means.
Not at all. And another band that was also transitioning, but unfortunately transitioning into their end period was Carcass, Swan Song. And again, if we had, an hour and 20 minutes worth of music that we could play and still have time to get into a lot of great doc sets, certainly we would have, thrown in a Carcass tune, because Swan Song, even though it's a controversial record, I still like it. I mean, it's a goofy record, I mean, it's like a great Megadeth record or something. I think
if you know the guy's personalities, how Jeff Walker is, it totally makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's no way you can go back to like Symphony's era. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
You hit a certain point and it's not there anymore. Yeah. So,
and again, you talk about a lot of these bands. This is when a lot of those underground bands have come above ground in the early '90s. They're starting to age. They're hitting their late 20s, and they're starting to think like, do I really want to be playing the fastest songs in the world, the most technical songs in the world forever? Like, how far can I go with this? Yeah,
I mean, just like with like the punk scene, like back in the 80s, is like, okay, you could maybe like a prolific band would put out maybe 2 to 3 records in like a couple year period, and they just fizzle out.
Yeah.
And it's weird to have this, extreme. This is like the next, kind of logical extension to that as far as the speed and everything. But some of these guys have been doing it for almost 30 years now.
Mm-hmm.
It's really bizarre because I think metal has like the most longevity out of any scene.
Yeah, it is weird. Like pop and mainstream rock and stuff, and kind of spits people out. They kind of get used to being popular, and then if they're not popular, they're done.
But these guys are also putting out.
Used to being
metal's always under, like 1 to 2 years new record out too. It's not like 5 year gaps, 6 years gaps.
Yeah, that's true, and they tour a lot, and they're usually pretty affordable tours to sort of get, there's no like $100 tickets that like totally has this access to like their music. Another band that I think was really exploring their rock and roll roots is a band that is near and dear to both of us, as Sentenced.
Came out with Amok.
Amok is a fantastic rock metal sort of masterpiece. And so there was a lot of different sort of things happening. Amorphous' Brave Order.
Black
Winter Day. I was thinking of Brave Murder Day from Catatonia for some reason. And that's a pretty transitional EP that's going to lead Amorphous into kind of their next phase with Elegy and the sort of ultra proggy kind of stuff. So it's a different time. And then we should mention and probably talk about them for a moment, because it was the last band actually to get cut from our set.
Opeth's Orchid.
And this was, the hard one, because I mean, Opeth is certainly an important band to Mark and I, and to, obviously fans of our podcast, and we've done a lot with Opeth, so we felt like it was okay to cut them loose, partially because their songs on Orchid are so long, and there's really no way to do justice by playing like, here's a 4-minute clip of it, but you don't really hear movement 4, 5, 6, and 7.
Yeah,
so,
and it's something that we've devoted a couple podcasts to them as well, so you can always go back in the archives and grab those.
Yeah, and we threw them on the 2001 with Blackwater Park, and so I mean, Opeth is certainly, no one would argue that they're not an important band, but one of the reasons we thought too to not throw them out on this podcast is because they didn't really break in 95. Orchid came out and it was very quiet throughout the whole scene. Guys like you and Chris were really the only people in America that were even like paying any attention.
I think a big problem was the cover art was like, if you got that as a promo, okay, that's going in my sell bin. I mean, it's a band you've never heard of. It's on Candlelight Records, which was hit and miss at this point as far as like what kind of bands they were putting out. And so I think a very few amount of people really cared.
Mm-hmm. And then it took, you guys kind of doing some of the reviews and then the Europe to sort of catch up to it. And it was really like, I feel like 96 is when Opeth really started to roll. And by the time Morning Rise came out, Orchid had kind of started to pick up steam and they put Morning Rise out and it like kind of made sense all of a sudden, But certainly Opeth will sort of, again, in a way, reinvigorate the European scene, just like Bride.
And the US scene.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot. I mean, Opeth, for how unremarkably
non-commercial
and unpenetrable their song links and some of their like progressive elements are, they just seem to like continue to defy the odds and build their fan base, and you have to again commend them for that. So but anyways, we want to another band that's kind of in its final phase of reinventing is Paradise Lost with Draconian Times, and like Bride, they this record came out and I think the response was pretty positive to it, even though it was almost shed a lot of its like doom metal roots, and it's almost
it's
firmly
like
a rock record.
Totally a rock record. It's really well produced. I mean, there's always those underground naysayers and people that never want anybody to ever progress beyond their demos, bitching about the vocals that they're like sellouts. But
was this as warmly received as Angel in the Dark River, or was it a little more controversial?
This was a record that had mass appeal way over My Dying Bride for sure. Yeah, people that loved, Metallica and thrash and that kind of scene glommed onto Paradise Lost really quickly.
Nick Holmes' vocals, especially in this record, really start to take on that James Hetfield kind of feel in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, what happens with 1 Second, that opens them up to the whole 4AD crowd and everybody else, and it's just... That was kind of like their last big record before, Host, and then they kind of diverge for a while and then come back strong.
Well, in Draconian Times, speaking of those Concrete Corner samplers, this is where I heard Hallowed Land and Enchantment were both on a Concrete Corner sampler, along with Deftones and
for those who don't know, like the Concrete Corner was basically like a little wire rack over by the metal section that had a bunch of free tapes that you could take, and basically just like little comp tapes.
It's hit or miss. I mean, I had some Concrete Corners that had Dishwalla on it, and then others where you'd get Paradise Lost. So it was. I
think it was one of those things to where specific labels would pay X amount of dollars to put songs on, and it was after a while, it did turn to turd, but it was a cool place like pre-internet to discover some new stuff.
Yeah. And so then we're going to take Paradise Lost into a new territory, and we're going to kind of get into the whole melodic Swedish death scene. And we'll talk a little bit more about that whole melodic Swedish death scene when we come back. But stay tuned for Paradise Lost, Once Solemn, and then In Flames will lead us into some different territory. And we'll talk all about those bands and keep them a surprise. But enjoy Once Solemn from Draconian Times.
Once all of the things I'm leaving alone. Once all of the looks that turn one to stone. And I'm not in the highs and the lows of the panic inside. And I'm not in the highs and the lows of the afraid promises. Tear me down, dig me now, push it away. come one time, it blew up, falling plants, fall in the morning hall. Shadows left, the fear inside, need a hand will never reach the other side, the other side, the other side. When the cradle breaks, broken griefs run along the in the morning hall. Shadows set the fear in the newborn's mind. Need a hand will never reach the other side, the other side, the other side.
That was Blind Guardians, Born in a Mourning Hall from Imaginations from the Other Sides.
Or Born in a Muddy Hole, as I thought it was originally.
Yeah, and Slaughter of the Soul from At the Gates with Suicide Nation, Dark Tranquilities, The One Brooding Warning from the Gallery, In Flames, Biosphere from the Subterranean EP, and then we open with Paradise Lost. So the trio in the middle, though, we'll talk about those first, then come back to Blind Guardian, which we just heard. But what do those three bands kind of have in common? The In Flames, Dark Tranquility, and At the Gates.
Hey, Sweden.
Hey, not only just Sweden, but Gothenburg. Correct?
Gothenburg. Yeah. Well,
to
an extent.
To an extent.
That was the largest city. Yeah. But
maybe some suburbs, maybe some
Yeah, as we were mentioned earlier with the whole war comp thing, which has came out in 95, has In Flames, Dark Tranquility, not At the Gates on it, but
Eucharist as well, another big Dissection
was on it, which we'll have later on the show, but that was just like a huge, as far as like the real underground stuff, because I know when you say Wrongian Records or War Records, which they later became, most people don't even know what the hell that is. It was such a small niche thing.
Well, now it's become Regain Records.
Regain Records, yeah. And that was like the blue note for us. Like anything, that was one of the few labels outside of early Earache that we could go, okay, anything that we see this label on, we'll buy.
Yeah,
and everything was great.
The first Arch Enemy, Miscreant,
Excretion, Mourning Sign,
Nagafar Vitra came out on, this is, and Nagafar Vitra is this year as well. And when we talk about this whole melodic Swedish death scene, they kind of play a role in that. But certainly the flagship bands, or the flagship band from War alongside, I think, Arch Enemy was probably In Flames. That was like the band at the moment. And I don't think anyone would have suspected it from, I don't know, was Lunar Strain, was that like a huge deal? Or did it really take Subterranean and the Jester Race before it like all started to come together for In Flames?
I don't really remember a whole lot of hubbub outside of just like in small circles.
Yeah.
But Jester Race kind of blew the doors off, really.
And Subterranean, for my money, that's almost the most solid 5 songs they ever wrote. It's one of the greatest metal EPs from start to finish I've ever heard. It's got Henke from Dawn on vocals, so it's a little extra harsh. It's got Daniel Urslanderson from Eucharist, who later will go on and drum for Arch Enemy. And so it's kind of this dynamic super group in a way, even though at the time nobody would have thought of it that way.
Well, and In Flames in this early state, I don't know if anybody actually remains from this initial inception.
Just
Jesper.
Jesper is about it. Well, no, Anders isn't in the band at this point.
No, he's in Ceremonial Oath right now. Yeah.
And so, because Glenn leaves and
forms Dimension Zero.
Was Bjorn drumming at this point? Oh, no, Daniel's on this. Yeah, so, yeah.
Well, Bjorn was drumming, then he became a guitarist.
Then he becomes a guitarist. But he's not on this one.
No.
But yeah, in terms of like triumphant metal, Biosphere, just a great, opening, very Iron Maiden-y, the whole... which we've talked about before when we talk about Gothenburg, the sort of twin leads, everything, is sort of operating. It's
almost like the young generation that grew up with Iron Maiden, but also grew up listening to Entombed records.
And Creator and Destruction and some of that kind of stuff, and Dark Tranquility is the Gallery, which was sort of their, one of their, I think, both their first records, Sky Dancer and this, were kind of both masterpieces in their own right, but this is a much tighter
Well, and this is more
focus.
indicative of where they'll go. They'll basically refine this formula for the next 15 years.
Although I think they've sort of simplified it a lot more. Like, the some of the guitar work is just so like meandering and like really, it's like solo after solo after it just kind of flows the whole time. And I've always had a soft spot for the one Brooding Warning for some reason, but the Gallery, I don't know, just in the Decibel Hall of Fame recently, and.
Well, we also had Unanimated's Ancient God of Evil.
This is true.
Vader's De Profundis came out this year.
Yep.
Ophthalmia.
Via Dolorosa.
Yeah, what does that mean?
It's Latin for something, I don't know.
Okay.
Latin or Italian.
Well, Gehenna, we had, kind of like the next, I guess the third wave of black metal, but Gehenna was always a band that, not the Gehenna with the hard rocker. Yeah, not those guys, King of the Sidewalk. But, Gehenna from Norway, who put out a string of, I think, 5 great records.
Certainly, yeah. But, this was sort of the Swedish Black Death kind of sound had kind of taken hold, and Dark Tranquility and In Flames, a lot of people who were into like the Nagafars and the Unanimateds and the Dissections were also kind of like okay with some of the melodies that were happening with Dark Tranquility and In Flames, and certainly At the Gate, Slaughter of the Soul, which... it's probably the album of this year. It's the one that everyone's going to talk the most about, probably historically from this point on, and it deserves its due.
Yeah, I think as far as influence goes,
this
Slaughter of the Soul and Stormy of the Lightsbane.
Yeah, those are just ginormous records, and we've talked a lot about At the Gates. We did the show with Albert and stuff, and we reflected on it. But certainly in terms of copycats, Slaughter of the Soul has probably been copied more times than
it's metalcore.
Yeah, it
wouldn't exist without it.
Yeah. So. And I bought this at the same time as I bought Moonspell's Wolfheart, which is another
great record.
Great record that we had to cut for time's sake. But it's funny, when I first heard At the Gate, Slaughter of the Soul on the Furnace radio station up in Mount Pleasant, where Mark and I grew up, I thought it was like an old Carcass song or something. I had no like context to put it, because I was like, I never heard anything like with melodies
Yeah.
And then the vocals, it was just sort of like, what is this? Like, it's not entombed. It's not, it just had its own kind of unique sound. So certainly this is the passing of the torch in a way from Stockholm to Gothenburg, at least for the time being.
And the snuffing of the torch as well.
Yeah, in a way. It's almost like the peak and it's going to dip out pretty quick. But then we end it with Blind Guardian's Imaginations from the Other Side, which is probably, in modern terms, I'd say the greatest power metal record ever made in the last probably 20 years, since 1990 forward. I don't know.
It's
There's almost no debate
listenable
for me.
Yeah, I mean, any song. The only reason we picked certain songs was time.
Yeah, time.
I mean, there's not a bad song on the record.
We figured we're doing a metal show, so let's not play one of the more melodic songs per se. But what's funny is it came out in 95, but it probably didn't hit us until 96, 97, because it was such an expensive import and very, very hard to find.
I think I paid $30 for it.
I definitely paid $30 for it. And in fact, we sold, I remember telling Hansi this when I interviewed him, we sold like 35 copies of this for like $30 a piece. And he was like, holy crap.
Well, I remember, like not for this album, but Nightfall in Middle Earth. I remember I was working at a gas station when that came out, and I had my dad, it was on hold at the record store, and I had my dad go get it. He's like, why the hell are you paying $30 for a CD? I'm like, oh, it's an import. It's
Blind Guardian. It's your
all right,
import.
whatever.
Yeah. And Blind Guardians, it's like a tank of sound coming over you. I told Mark it's like listening to like 3D. It's just like everything happening. And
if Michael Bay was good.
Yeah.
If Jerry Bruckheimer had some kind of artistic sensibilities.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it would sound like. But anyways, in Blind Guardian, we'll go on and make some great records after this, Nightfall, which Mark mentioned, stuff. But certainly this is opening the gateway to what's going to become, unfortunately, the late 90s power metal scene. And early 2000s.
Hammer Falls, but we did get
Nocturnal Rites and some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but we did get Primal Fear. We got that first record from.
We did.
We got $.
Heck yeah.
Which I kind of want to do a show on that record.
We will. It's coming down the pike, I'm sure. But if you don't have Imagination from the Other Side, it's as seminal as Slaughter of the Soul and The Gallery and
it's been reissued by Century Media, so it's affordable now.
Yeah, you don't have to pay $30. But we're going to end things kind of talking about where black metal kind of goes. And Mark already mentioned Gehenna, but in Moonspell we mentioned, which was sort of a weird gothic black metal kind of mixture, but minus some of the pretenses that Cradle of Filth and some of those gothic black metal bands were kind of.
It was more romantic, I guess. It was less theatrical.
Yeah, romantic. It was more mysterious. It had like, the vampirism and the sort of the wolf imagery. I mean, it kind of almost had like a Universal Studios like horror film.
It was almost
to it.
It was like Danzig amped up as far as the thematic stuff goes.
For sure. There was Midnight Ride definitely had a Danzig feel to it off Wolfheart, but. Dark Throne's Panzerfaust came out. The Nordic Metal compilation, which featured a lot of great bands in tribute to Euronymous, and Arcturus's Aspira Hymn Symphona, which pained me to not play a song from that because that was such one of my first, if not my first favorite black metal record, alongside Dissection, Stormy Light's Bane. Because the girl I was dating in high school at the time was really jacked up about Arcturus for some reason. She was into classical music, so that makes sense. It hit her, on all fronts, as well as In Flames.
The musicianship.
I think I told you at Moonshield we got played at our prom.
Yeah,
which is pretty remarkable. But the two black metal records that we did select to play for you this time is Immortal and Dissection. So tell us
Battles in the North at the Stormy Gates of Mist.
Yeah,
I'm still standing. Battles in the North, when it first came out, people thought it was an absolute shitstorm because it was so fast front to back.
To at first.
It's got really abrupt stops in between songs, and
I mean, Pure Holocaust was fast, but this is like the whole.
This is retarded. I mean, I don't know if this was like one of maybe the first good attempts at the hyperspeed black metal stuff.
Yeah.
But it actually, especially this track at the Stormy Gates of Mist, had really bizarre, almost like. The guitar, the vocals, and the drums are all at different time signatures, and probably out of the amateur nature of these guys and not really knowing what they're doing. But their end result is really fantastic, and this is one of my favorite all-time records. I think for this
Mark is a
reason, I'm a huge Immortal fan, especially the second, third, and some of the later on stuff. But Pure Holocaust and Battles in the North are like kind of the penultimate black metal stuff in my turns.
Yeah. I think
complete abandoning the whole satanic imagery.
Yeah.
This is all Bioshere all the time.
Yep. And Dissection of Stormy Light's Bane, where we're going to sort of end things, was kind of the it record in terms of black metal. I mean, this sort of brought a lot of camps together. It was a Swedish black metal record, which was sort of odd.
And
It was melodic.
it was considered, I guess, Black Death at the time, whatever that means. And it also had a lot of not mainstream appeal, but more, it broke down a lot of barriers with people even people that were more into grind, and something just jumped out about this.
Well, I think it's tight, it's fast.
I mean, it's like the Slaughter of the Soul version of black metal.
Yeah, yeah. I think what some people, maybe heard A Blaze in the Northern Sky and were like, this is too sloppy, this type of sound. It's too lazy or something, or too lo-fi.
It's harsh.
Yeah, too lo-fi in a way. And this is like bombastic, big, but still scary, but yet still catchy. It kind of had every element working for it, and it was an easy
And there's a lot of
sell.
thrash in it.
Yeah. You'll hear it in the Retribution, Stormy Light's Bane, the track we're gonna play, and it's got a lot of like classical, like leads to it, and like almost like 70s, early 80s kind of Iron Maiden-y kind of stuff going on. It's a great record. It's a great place to end 95. I think it represents sort of the future and how black metal was alongside the sort of Gothenburg Swedish scene. They were gonna kind of take the torch, and they're going to take the late 90s metal scene forward,
And
for good and
with the
bad,
ship, yeah.
I mean, it's a weird era, and there's definitely a weird gap between 95 and 2001, which is one of the episodes we did recently. So, but Immortal, Dissection, this is a good way to end it. So let us know what you thought. 1995. We'll be back soon with some more stuff. But shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com, or check us out on our website, requiempodcast.com.
Subscribe to us on iTunes. Leave us a star review. That would be awesome.
Yeah. So for 1995, I am Jason.
And I'm Mark.
And this is Immortals at the Stormy Gates of Mist and Dissection's Retribution.